power isn't just about what you control. It's about what you make others believe you control. And for over a century, there was one family that controlled not just the wealth of nations, but the very pulse of the East, without anyone even knowing their name. What if I told you that there exists a family whose influence spans decades, whose wealth rivals some of the most famous dynasties of the West, and whose legacy still lingers in the shadows of international politics? A family that has shaped the economies of nations, manipulated entire industries, and, in some instances, played both sides of history's most violent conflicts. Yet their name is not one that rolls off the tongue like the Rothschilds or the Rockefellers. This family doesn't flaunt its wealth. It has worked in the dark, preferring to stay hidden behind faceless corporations, governments, and the whispers of the powerful. They are the Rothschilds of the East, and for a long time, the world had no idea they even existed. But that is what makes them so dangerous. The greatest power is the one never see coming. The Rothschilds of the East were not born into power or fame. Their story begins in the streets of a humble city, far removed from the well-known financial capitals of the world. The family emerged in the 19th century in a place that was a far cry from the grand banks of London or Paris. Instead, they hailed from the shadowy corners of Russia, their beginnings linked to a land of upheaval, revolution, and constant conflict. In the vast, windswept plains of Eastern Europe, where empires rose and fell like waves in an unrelenting sea, this family would emerge from the underbelly of the Russian Empire, their roots entrenched in the world of finance, trade, and industry. But unlike the Rothschilds, who amassed wealth in the Western world, this family understood the subtle art of quietly controlling power behind the scenes. In the early 1800s, Europe was a cauldron of revolution and change. The Russian Empire, despite its size and strength, was an unstable beast, constantly threatened by uprisings, the spread of Western ideals, and the internal struggles between its aristocracy and its masses. It was in this environment that a small group of merchants, no different from the countless others trying to make their fortunes in the vast expanse of Eastern Europe, began to carve out a space for themselves. Their roots were tied to trade routes that crossed the borders of Russia, Poland, and the Ottoman Empire, their influence growing quietly unnoticed. At first, they were no more than traders, businessmen navigating the chaos of imperial politics, who made small investments and turned them into something much bigger. But it was their strategic genius that set them apart. The family understood early on that money wasn't just about making profits. It was about understanding where power was being concentrated, where it could be seized, and where it could be used to shape the fate of entire nations. They made quiet alliances with bankers, generals, and the imperial court. Through these alliances, they began to accumulate wealth, but not in the way most people thought. It wasn't through public displays of opulence or through grandiose acts of generosity. No, this family was far more calculating. They invested in areas that seemed trivial at first, small industries, local banks, shipping, but soon their influence began to ripple outward, spreading into the arms of the empire's most powerful industries. The turning point came in the mid-19th century, when the family secured a major deal with Tsarist Russia, gaining control over a vast portion of the country's mineral resources. At the time, Russia was one of the most resource-rich countries in the world. Copper, gold, coal, and oil waiting to be extracted. It was a deal that would change everything. With the Tsar's blessing, this family could now shape not just Russia's economy, but its entire geopolitical future. They invested heavily in the mining sector, turning it into a well-oiled machine, extracting wealth from the very earth beneath Russia's feet. And yet their involvement remained largely unnoticed by the wider world. The family kept their names out of the papers, preferring to operate behind closed doors, leveraging their influence quietly, like invisible architects constructing the skyline of a new world. But their rise wasn't solely limited to Russia. By the late 1800s, the family had begun to extend its reach into the Ottoman Empire, an unstable but strategically vital region in Europe and Asia. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire on the horizon, this family, ever the opportunists, positioned itself as the key financier of what would soon become the modern-day Middle East. Their banks held power over key trade routes, Their wealth flowed into the construction of massive infrastructure projects, and their connections reached into the very heart of Europe's great powers. With one foot in Russia and the other in the Middle East, they were able to create a vast web of influence that spanned continents. But it wasn't just about controlling resources. It was about controlling the flow of those resources. By the early 20th century, the family had become the shadowy force behind some of the most significant geopolitical events of the time: the Russian Revolution, World War I, the creation of new nations in the Middle East. These were all shaped by the family's quiet, strategic investments. They didn't just sit on the sidelines. They were active participants in shaping the course of history. And yet, no one ever really saw them. Their wealth was hidden behind layers of bureaucracy, shell companies, and false fronts. In the eyes of the world, they were simply wealthy financiers. But in reality, they were puppeteers, pulling the strings of empires and governments. Watching from the shadows as the world transformed, as their power grew, so too did the public's reaction. The people, those who were barely scraping by, began to feel the invisible hand of this family in their lives. It was whispered that their wealth and influence were responsible for the suffering of the masses. Their investments had driven the prices of essentials to astronomical heights. They were seen as the embodiment of greed, of the ruthlessness that defined the upper echelons of power. Governments trembled at the thought of challenging them, knowing that their reach extended far beyond the borders of the empires they controlled. In Russia, they were seen as nothing more than opportunists, manipulating the resources of an already desperate nation for their own gain. In the Ottoman Empire, their banks were accused of propping up a crumbling regime, siphoning wealth from the very people they claimed to protect. It was in the early 20th century that the family's moral gray area became more apparent. They were both saviors and villains, liberators and exploiters. On one hand, they were the architects of some of the largest infrastructure projects in history. Bringing oil, gas, and steel to the world stage, they financed hospitals, schools, and roads, carving a modernized world out of the wreckage of empires. Yet on the other hand, they were responsible for bankrupting entire nations, for controlling markets in ways that stifled competition, for fueling wars and revolutions, and for playing both sides of history's most brutal conflicts. They were both the masters and the pawns of a system that was designed to exploit the many for the benefit of the few. As the years passed, their empire began to falter. Wars, political upheaval, and changing economic dynamics began to chip away at their vast fortune. The Russian Revolution of 1917 left them with little more than dust and rubble. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire erased much of their presence in the Middle East, but their decline was not a complete fall. Even as their formal holdings diminished, their legacy remained embedded in the fabric of global finance. Their wealth may have been scattered, but their influence quiet, insidious remained. Today, the Rothschilds of the East are a shadow of what they once were. The family no longer holds the power it once did, but its influence can still be felt in some of the most powerful industries and governments of the world. Their wealth, though spread thin, is still vast. Their descendants operate behind the scenes, holding controlling stakes in some of the world's largest corporations. Their fingerprints still on global trade, finance, and geopolitics. The family may have faded from the public eye, but the legacy of their power is not so easily erased. As we reflect on their rise and fall, we are left with a sobering realization. Power, money, and history are often intertwined in ways we cannot fully understand. The Rothschilds of the East were more than just a family. They were a force that shaped nations, controlled economies, and manipulated history. But their story is not just one of wealth. It is a story of how power works in the shadows, how it shifts, how it operates unseen, and how it ultimately shapes the world in ways that few ever truly comprehend. In the end, we are left to ask, who really controls the world? Is it the politicians we see on our screens, or is it the families who work in the silence between the cracks of power, shaping the world from behind the curtains? History tells us one thing: power, in its purest form, is never truly visible. It is always hidden in the shadows, where only the few can see its hand, wield it.